Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ivan Kanapathy. Today we're at the Taipei Security Dialogue, Taiwan's equivalent of the Shangri-La Dialogue. We're about to sit down with Ivan Kanapathy, the co-author of The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. He served on the White House's National Security Council staff as Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia. Welcome to Taiwan Talks.
Great to be here.
So today we're talking about your book, Boiling Moat, which you collaborated with Matt Pottinger on, about the urgency of defending Taiwan. Now, you've mentioned previously that Xi Jinping made some moves sort of in the mid-2010s, but he decided at that point that the PLA wasn't ready. Is that correct? What year was that?
During his first term, I think he wanted the PLA ready. There's definitely some things he said in speeches that indicated, you could argue he wanted the PLA to reach some level of ability in 2020, and then again in 2021, kind of got readjusted. And I think the latest is 2027, which is the more commonly quoted now. Mm-hmm. There's no guarantee that they'll meet that deadline, but I think they're certainly much closer than they were.
Mm. Because in terms of the urgency of defending Taiwan, is that down to, an expected date that the PLA would be capable, or is it more to do with the unpreparedness of Taiwan, the US, allies?
So I think it's all those things combined, and it's not like there's going to be one day when a switch is flipped. It's more, I think it's better to think about it as a confidence level. And so he maybe thinks, all right, if I send the PLA in today, he could argue, and I don't know what he thinks, but maybe he thinks like 30%. But he wants by 2027 to feel like, I got a pretty good shot. I got like an 80% feeling that they're gonna win if I send them. So I think it's like more of a scale. You have to think about it, and so there's not necessarily a hard date. And if the political imperatives require at an earlier date, maybe he's willing to gamble on 50% or whatever his sense is. You know what I mean? So I think, but as that confidence level increases, the Taiwan needs to be more and more concerned, because it kind of gives Xi Jinping a little bit more play. He can then push and be more aggressive, be more coercive, because he feels like he has this other option sort of in his back pocket.
The use of force.
The use of force, exactly.
Right.
As he becomes more confident in having that other option.
You talked about the political factors maybe bringing that date forward. What might they be?
Well, a number of things. There's some real obvious ones where, if Taiwan were to declare independence, he might feel politically forced into making that decision.
Have you looked into what might be his calculus? What are all the different factors that he needs to calculate to make that move in order to inform, U.S. defense policy?
From a military standpoint, I think about it, I guess, a little simplistic, that there are four kind of big things he's looking for. The PLA has achieved two of them, probably even before Xi Jinping was there. The first one is sort of embodied in the PLA rocket force, the ability to just really pummel Taiwan. And they've had that for decades, frankly. They've got
It's not too far for them to do that.
So it's not far, and they've got thousands of weapons pointed at this island. The second one, which they kind of came to and realized they needed, I would say, certainly the 96 Strait crisis, was the ability to keep the United States away and the Allies away, at least for some period of time. And that's what we call
area denial.
A2AD, yeah. Exactly. Anti-access area denial weapons, which they've invested in heavily, and I would say they're quite confident and have that. The two things he's lacking, not quite there, that they're working on, that number three would be lift capacity, to bring enough boots on the ground across the strait fast enough to kind of do the blitzkrieg, if you will, and take over a airport, and then move on to, a city, and probably, relatively quickly, he would hope get to Taipei, right?
Because you believe that must be a component of taking Taiwan.
I think that taking Taiwan, well, unless of course Taiwan would capitulate under a blockade scenario, which I increasingly believe is not likely. at least not for a long time. And
Why do you
hope.
increasingly believe that?
I increasingly believe that just from my time here in Taiwan, kind of observing how much has changed even in Taiwan in the last decade, with how especially young people, but really all people, have kind of come to the conclusion that they don't want to be, Hong Kong played into this, Ukraine played into this, how they don't want to be a part of the PRC, at least not as the PRC exists today, right? Under the, but anyway, so I do think that the Taiwanese society has a lot of built-in resilience. They just need to understand what resources they need to then employ that sort of natural psychology. And I think there's a lot of good things happening in Taiwan. But to go back, that fourth and final thing that I don't believe Xi Jinping is fully confident in yet is he believes he needs to have more, not pure, but more parity with the United States in nuclear weapons. And he's working on that very rapidly right now, which is part of the 2027 or thereabouts confidence level discussion.
So what were the predictions by the Pentagon in terms of those nuclear assets? By 2030, they would have...
2030, 1,000 warheads. I think right now we're already at roughly 500. So,
and how does that compare to the US's? Is
I think
significantly
the
more?
US has a couple thousand deployed warheads, but I think Xi Jinping feels like 500 is not enough to kind of start this thing, and that's a question of how they feel, because they're afraid the U.S. is going to actually initiate nuclear. That's a whole different discussion. But yeah, I think the Chinese feel like they need to have more.
Right. I always thought that was Chinese propaganda to say that the U.S. would initiate a
Yeah,
nuclear war.
I think so. And it's interesting because China has this no first use policy.
Yeah.
And they've continued to pressure the United States to also adopt a no first use policy. I find that interesting because I don't put a lot of faith in China's no first use policy, meaning they can say it and then, when push comes to shove, just change their mind, right? Whereas I think in a democracy, that's actually a lot harder, right? If that's a declared policy, I think it would be much more difficult. And China knows that, which is why they sort of play this propaganda game, I think.
Yeah. So in the book, there were, I understand, identified the three greatest weaknesses for Taiwan's defense. And one of those was the culture or the leadership of the Ministry of Defense. Could you tell us about what you believe is the problem?
Yeah, and so we believed, that the Ministry of Defense and probably just the leadership isn't necessarily fully aligned, I think, with the mission of defending Taiwan. This is a historical sort of result, and it comes from the fact that, quite frankly, for decades, the military here existed with the mission to take back China. I mean, that sort of was the driving. I think that's what people were taught. That's what they were trained. When you join the military, that was your overriding goal. And you can see it even now. You can see it reflected in the force structure, where there seems to be an overemphasis on power projection type capabilities and not as much as an emphasis on purely defensive and island defense type capabilities.
I see. So you're saying that the symmetrical purchases of weapon systems are actually offensive. They're actually about taking Beijing, as opposed to simply defending with asymmetrical, smaller, more mobile.
That's right.
systems.
No, that's exactly right. I think it's actually, it would be hard to conceive of if you were to build from scratch. How am I going to defend this island? I wouldn't, I was building the military force from scratch. I wouldn't be buying a bunch of tanks and armored vehicles. I wouldn't be buying a bunch of frigates and destroyers.
Do you think it could be also, the desire to not let the enemy come too close to our shores and, maybe not having that practice and that integration with the US in terms of drills and exercises and being fully confident that the US would actually come to defend Taiwan?
Well, it's funny you say that, because actually I think this makeup of more conventional offensive type platform-centric warfare is follows the U.S. model, because that's exactly what the United States has. And to be honest, the U.S., I think, from a security cooperation standpoint, probably bears a lot of the blame for it, because I think we encouraged it for many, many years. And it's just kind of how we did business with a lot of partners. We said, if you want a good military, then here's the model. It's us.
Going back to the Taiwan's military, do you believe there is a political component to the military and their ability or their willingness to fight China?
I think that would depend probably on individuals. I talk about in the book that I have spoken to senior military officers here in Taiwan. This is a few years ago. One of whom said to me that they wouldn't fight in a war if it was, quote unquote, for Taiwanese independence. And I don't know how they would define that, because I think, if China were to attack Taiwan, and I kind of tried to tease this question out, but I didn't get a good answer. I said, well, look, if China attacks, then it's conceivable that the end result from that is Taiwan saying, no way, right? Like, and therefore this war becomes a war of independence. I mean, it just does by nature. So there are, and this again kind of ties to the history of the military, which was obviously an ROC military, a KMT military. But I think the culture of the military itself is changing. The question is, and I don't know the answer to this internally, has it changed enough? How's the senior leadership feel about it, about the mission at hand and things like that?
Do you think that the accusation of hyping war, do you think that's something that feeds into the political divides within Taiwan?
Yeah, it does, and it's so hard to separate like what's, just truly how people feel here in Taiwan versus how much has been influenced by, the red media, if you will, and the propaganda. And people argue about how much of each there is, but certainly that's a narrative that China wants to push here for certain, that, that the U.S. is here, really stirring up trouble and is going to lead Taiwan down this path to war. But that's to China's advantage, because they don't want Taiwan to invest more in their defense, right? I mean, it's a very clear objective.
Yeah. So when it comes to the U.S., what are the most urgent changes that need to be made?
So for U.S. forces, I think you've seen the Marine Corps has created something called these Marine Littoral Regiments, which are a little bit of a microcosm of what we'd probably recommend Taiwan's entire military kind of do to itself, to transform and change capabilities and change weapon systems, including things like anti-ship missiles, more short-range sort of surface-to-air capabilities, certainly more information and cyber type of warfare capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, and then, of course, just a lot of autonomous systems, drones, expendable drones included, and a lot more munitions, frankly, just a lot of missiles. Mm-hmm. One thing I'll note, about 1 month into the Ukraine war, so this would have been March of 2022, you can look this up, President Zelensky, he said, there's a quote out there where he said that I need 300 Stingers and 300 Javelins every day. That was a month into the war, so already 30 days have elapsed, and he's still saying, I need 300 of Stingers, 300 Javelins a day. In 2015, Taiwan and the United States agreed to sell to Taiwan 250 Stingers. That was 2015. And in 2019, we agreed to sell 250 more. And that's where we are, 500 Stingers here in Taiwan. So a lot more to kind of drive that point home is needed.
Is there the industrial base in the US to provide those?
Well, that's certainly a problem. and they won't come as rapidly as we want them to. But I could also say, as anyone would want them to, but I could also say that, rather than stopping at 500, it'd be great to see an order of, whatever, 5,000, even if, because what's happening right now is a lot of other countries in Eastern Europe and places like that, they're getting in line, they're ordering them, and Taiwan's going to have to wait even longer. So I think that's an important point, like waiting, and we'll figure out how to expand the industrial base. That's happening. It's happening slowly, but the more actual contracts that come in, the more easily actually the United States will be able to do that with partners and stuff. We've got other partners involved in production also.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the South China Sea. As a military guy, ex-military guy, how concerned are you about China's actions there?
I'm pretty concerned. China is pushing. They seem to be trying to take a little more ground every time, and I worry sometimes if and when the United States will be willing to take some action. I think the United States will be willing to take some action. A decade plus ago, in 2012, at Scarborough Shoal, from the Philippine point of view, the United States did not sort of honor its treaty obligation, and that did tremendous damage for our credibility and reputation in the Philippines. I hope that doesn't happen. I can see a very similar incident developing at Sabina Shoal right now in the South China Sea, between the Philippines and China, and so I'm a little bit concerned, but we'll have to see. Hopefully, we've learned our lesson. The United States has.
I mean, the recent comments by Admiral Samuel Paparo, and basically reinforcing what Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said. It seems that it'd be very hard to back down from.
It would be. I think it would be very hard to back down. But that's the incident where somebody dies, which is certainly an issue. We've seen some dangerous. We had, I think, a Filipino sailor lose his thumb.
All right. So you're actually saying that, that mutual defense treaty, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be triggered by Marcos's, the death of a Filipino?
The treaty would be, but and we've been clear about that. And I think if a Filipino sailor died, there would be repercussions. I'm not saying the United States would go to war or do anything kinetic, but I think there would be, I don't know if it would be sanctions type issues, some kind of diplomatic or what have you. But the United States would certainly be obligated to go to the Philippines and say, okay, how do we, and take the actions we need to make that right. But in a Sabina Shoal, Scarborough Shoal incident, the treaty may not even ever officially be triggered, but we still, in that situation, we, the United States, end up sort of losing credibility.
Right.
In a big way.
Yeah. If there's that loss of that territory to China.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's happened. So going back to the Taiwan contingency, should an invasion actually occur, what nations or which nations do you expect could be drawn into this conflict?
I think Japan for certain, in some capacity, just because the United States will be basing out of there as a minimum, and also Japan, I think, would feel, to do some kind of active defense of its own territory. I believe that Australia would be there. I'd like to think the United Kingdom. And I'm not sure about the rest. It really would depend how the circumstances unfold, I think.
And how about South Korea?
I think about South Korea and Europe, our allies in Europe, the same way, where if we really got into it with China, we would probably be withdrawing significant forces from South Korea and from Europe in order to backfill, right? So that we could flow forces toward wherever the China contingency. And then the South Korean forces and NATO forces in Europe would then have to sort of kind of stay put, if you will, to create the deterrence of North Korea and Russia.
Okay.
I think that would be how they think about it and how they'd be best employed, most likely. And that's because they're all going to try to take advantage of this situation. They're all working together. As China and Russia have had more joint military exercises this year than we've seen forever. The North Koreans are supplying the Russians, the Iranians are supplying Russians. So we have to assume that there will be some kind of simultaneity, right? Just the opportunistic of this axis of chaos,
right.
I guess, is my co-author Matt Pottinger put it.
Yeah. Do you think that there would be any kind of consultation between this axis? I mean, we know that Xi Jinping was not consulted, or do we know that before the invasion of Ukraine?
I don't know that we know. My impression, and I can't say this with any certainty, my impression is that Xi Jinping gave the do what you need to do, but don't do it till after the Olympics, right? Which is exactly what happened. So now whether Xi Jinping knew it would be to the extent it was, maybe he thought, I've heard reports that maybe he thought it was going to be something less. But there was obvious, to me it seems obvious it was 2 days after, day after the Olympics ended, right? And you've heard the kind of hot mic moment that Xi Jinping, when he went, I think in March of 2023 to Russia, March or April, and kind of got caught when he was saying goodbye to Putin.
Talking about the changes in 100 years.
Yeah. Well, more importantly, yes, there are changes on the century, but more importantly, he said, together, you and I are driving these changes. So I think there's maybe not detailed coordination, but I think it's, that alone tells me it's coordination, right? And they've spent so much time together, those two. So, I think recently, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Kirk Campbell, has even said that, we consider, I think he considers, that effectively China's also providing lethal assistance
to Russia. Okay.
In their war in Ukraine.
So final question. You've worked under Trump administration, obviously. Are Asian allies' fears about, Trump's commitment, should he become president, are they substantiated?
I think probably European allies' fears should be more substantiated. I actually just, my experience with our Asian allies, with our closest allies, Japan, Australia, in particular, were that they were actually very, very happy sort of to transition from Obama to Trump. And what they indicated to me were quite worried that a lot of the Obama people were going to come back into Biden admin. Now, to be clear, they were relieved that things didn't go back from a policy standpoint, that they kind of stayed on. And so I think, the Trump admin is the ones that kind of put this policy in place. And I think in a lot of ways you can argue that the pivot / rebalance of the early Obama years, 2012-ish, never happened until Trump came in and kind of did the Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think is, what the pivot was hoping to accomplish. And we've seen that, and that's been great. And the Biden administration's done a great job of that too. So I don't think Asian allies have anything to worry about. I believe that in the case of the Philippines and South Korea, during the Trump era, we were dealing with some some leadership that had come in with doubts from the United States performance in the 2010s. And so Duterte came in and was like, I can't count on the U.S. And we talked about this. Scarborough was part of that. And so he inched a lot closer to China. Moon Jae-in came in and also was not somebody that we could count on, whether it came to, frankly, North Korea or China. And once those folks left, I think, and U.S. policy became much clearly like, no, we are here, we're here to stay, which again, I think started in the Trump era, I don't think you'll get people coming back in the Philippines or in South Korea that will take that extreme of a position, sort of, frankly, not aligned with the United States that they did.
And the way we've been talking in this interview is that the US would come to Taiwan's defense.
You know, circumstances depending, but I think if it was clearly an act of aggression, right, that was unprovoked, essentially by China there, then I think so. But it's, at the end of the day, it's a presidential decision.
And also, as you've said many times, also about the Taiwanese showing their willingness to defend their country as well.
Right. And then we write about this a lot in the book, and it's sort of the idea that really if Taiwan sort of collapses in the first week, right, whether it's an embargo or it's an actual invasion, like, which is thousands and thousands of rockets and missiles hitting Taiwan, if Taiwan capitulates, then that's it. The U.S. really doesn't have an ability to change that. And so it's similar to when Zelensky, you know, when the United States went to Zelensky and offered him a ride. And he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, or something to that effect, right? Like, that's the attitude Taiwan needs to express in order to get the coalition help. So it doesn't actually matter if we have the treaty or not. It's more about the will and the capability, and demonstrating that will by both the United States and Taiwan.
Ivan Kanapathy, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Great to be here with you. Thanks.
Thank you.